Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all doing well. I'm actually recording from my house this morning, so don't be concerned if my cat decides to jump in front of us. It is totally expected. I wanted to check in with so many things today. This is usually the time of year that I really wish that we had the opportunity to meet face to face because there has just been a lot of really good discussion that I want to touch on. And at this point in the semester, I usually see you shifting from this point of surprise about some of the myths and realities of gifted education, and I start to see evidence that you really want to advocate for gifted children. So that's always really encouraging to me as the instructor, and I want to commend this class especially, even in your discussion post and in your gifted case studies, which I'll discuss in a moment. You've done a really good job of demonstrating that you want to take this material outside of the classroom, and that's really encouraging. That's the point of these classes. So let's jump on in. I wanted to start with just some recap on characteristics of gifted children, mainly because I just have to call some of you out for some of the great examples that you included in your case studies. So when we think of gifted children, usually from a stereotypical standpoint, they are the perfect kids who are in the front of the classroom and always paying attention. And as we have seen in several of our discussion posts and these case studies, that is often far from the truth. So I wanted to point out some of the ways that you all identified gifted characteristics within your case studies and lead that into some conversation for our learning module that we are currently on that investigates whether gifted education is a right or a privilege. So some of the most convincing evidence that you all gave was just really good examples of how your child that you were investigating is just completely different from his or her same age peers. So Drew, in her case study, actually said that she found Sawyer, the student she was working with, to be thinking and responding to life in different ways. And I just love that quote because it shows that this gifted child is not just gifted in math or gifted in science. When we have a truly gifted child, they interpret life around them in a different way, both inside and outside of the classroom. Christy actually decided to time one of her students during independent reading time and found that this child read independently for an hour and 12 minutes. If that is not demonstration of task commitment, I don't know what is. In fact, when we study creativity, we'll look into this concept called flow. Some of you guys, maybe if you're into yoga, you've maybe heard this. It's kind of started to trickle into this yoga world of being really mindful. But there's a researcher named Csikszentmihalyi. His name starts with a C. It's like Csiz or something. But that's how you pronounce him. It's Csikszentmihalyi. He has this concept in creativity called flow, and it's literally when we lose ourselves in ideas. So this concept of like the artist who just works and works and forgets to eat, or the musician who's just composing and doesn't realize that hours have disappeared. That's this concept of flow, and we can see that in our gifted children sometimes when they are so lost in one idea and they're so invigorated in their own world that they are just completely oblivious to what's going on around them. So I thought that was a really cool and interesting depiction of how we may see that in the classroom. Melina told a fun story of a kid making an invention of a trailer to pull behind his skateboard and how he used some common household objects to do that. That's a great example of imagination and creativity. Also a lot of self-start there. So gifted children oftentimes have these really elaborate projects that they're working on, but no one ever told them to do that. So I think that's really interesting. Several of you wrote about students that are identified as having ADHD or some kind of attention issue. And I wanted to point on a couple of areas of research that have investigated ADHD and creativity. So actually, there's a lot of overlap between the two. And since a lot of you discussed this within your case studies, I thought it would be good for me to give you some potential further resources. So if you look into the works of Dr. Bonnie Cramond, it's Cramond, you'll see that she has done some really interesting work at looking at the overlap between measurement tools that identify creativity and measurement tools that identify characteristics of ADHD. And oftentimes, individuals that are super, super creative are also all over the place. They seem really disorganized. So it's interesting in that characteristic checklist, several of you said, well, he's really intense and he's got lots of different interests, but he's definitely not organized, because you should see his work folders. They're like everywhere, and he's got stuff all over the place. He's not organized. That's really common of creative individuals because they have so many ideas. It could be that they are organized in their perspective, but not in our perspective. So when we study creativity, one thing we'll see is that highly creative individuals see connections between multiple ideas. So actually, this concept of being all over the place is because they see a connection between this math concept and this English concept and this music concept, so they don't understand why they would keep everything in neat folders, because to them, everything connects. So really highly creative people often seem really crazy to us. Actually, there's a interesting relationship between madness and creativity. And I'm sure you guys have heard the classic story of like the gifted mad genius who's a little bit crazy. There's actually some truth to that. I'm writing an article on that right now, that those who have relationships or like familial relationships, like their parents or a distant relative has something like schizophrenia, actually carrying those genes may make you more creative, because you can see some more connections between ideas, which is kind of mind-blowing. So I thought it would be good to point that out. Several of you mentioned, oh, this student isn't very organized, but he or she is very creative. And that doesn't really surprise me. Oftentimes, super creative individuals have so many ideas going on that they don't see the point in categorizing different things, because they see all of their ideas meshing into one. So if you're interested in looking at that potential relationship between ADHD and creativity, I think a good place to start would be Dr. Cramond's work. This is a good opportunity for me to make a plug that at the end of the semester, our final module is actually special topics, and you have the opportunity to investigate one topic from the class in further detail. So start thinking about that of, ooh, this is an interesting topic. I want to look into that more. As you're working on your discussion posts and your other assignments. So I have had students in the past investigate this ADHD creativity relationship, and it's a good one for special topics. I appreciated Alexis commenting that we need to use checklists that have more detail. I told you at the beginning I didn't love this checklist, mainly because I think it's written too positively. There's not much evidence of these concomitant, however you say the word, problems. And there's a lot of student is curious, but it doesn't give the example that curiosity might be reading the book under the table and not paying attention. Another issue with this checklist, which Alexis pointed out, is it's not super reliable, because some teachers can just check but not give any anecdotal evidence. So how I identify intensity may be very different than how another individual identifies intensity. And because of that, there's not a lot of validity or reliability in this, because we don't really know what we're actually measuring, and between myself and a different individual, we're measuring that construct differently. So I agree that a more appropriate checklist requires some of that anecdotal evidence. So we see not just a check next to high curiosity, we see examples of that. And several of you did that within this activity, actually wrote specific examples, and I found that really powerful. One of you, I want to call you out by name, Cindy, actually talked about working with a student who was currently struggling in gifted and talented services and asking 2 other teachers to complete this checklist and look at how this child was still demonstrating all of these characteristics of giftedness, even in some surprising ways. So I thought that was a really powerful use of the checklist, because we had Cindy advocating for this child and then asking the 2 other teachers to also use this checklist. And in doing that, you're providing a lot more proof of the child's giftedness. So anytime we are bringing multiple resources, multiple sources of information into identification procedures, what we're doing is, the research word for that is, we are triangulating the evidence. Just think of a triangle, right? So a triangle has, here we go, triangle has 3 points. So we can't make a decision based off of this one point. We need multiple pieces of evidence that show this giftedness. So characteristic checklists like this are powerful, but they shouldn't be the sole indicator. Especially, they shouldn't be the sole indicator of giftedness only if they are completed by one individual. So I really liked how Cindy asked other people to complete this checklist with her. Just all of that being said, I think that you did a good job looking at your student and thinking about how his or her behaviors, both positive and negative, could be potential indicators of giftedness. This is one of my favorite activities to grade, because you guys just do a really good job of talking about how these characteristics may indicate giftedness and how that may actually surprise us. So great job on that. They should all be graded. If they're not, let me know. I wanted to take a moment to lead into, we don't discuss this in detail in this course, but I did want to talk about identification of giftedness for just a minute, because it's tricky, right? So you're seeing these characteristics checklists, and some of you actually then looked into the child's scores and saw, oh great, I identified this student as gifted based on this checklist. Then I looked at their COGAT scores, and it happens to be that they are gifted according to those scores. It is difficult for me to look at identification procedures that are very highly related to test scores and not also related to these checklists that look at how giftedness manifests in various ways. So that's just a point for me that's difficult, because some tests are very biased, and some tests, some children just don't do as well on standardized tests. But I did want to talk through identification procedures, specifically for South Carolina. So what you're seeing this week in Right versus Privilege is that gifted education is very state run. Not just that, it's very district run. Not just that, sometimes it's very school run. Not just that, sometimes it really depends on the teacher. It's his or herself. So I believe it was Drew who really traced this hierarchy of we start at like this federal level of, we have this vague definition of what giftedness is, but we don't really say you have to give gifted education. All of that is based on what the states say. And the state says one thing, but then the districts really have to carry out what the states are saying. And then from the districts, the schools have to implement these ideas. And then from the schools, the teachers have to actually put the ideas into place. And oftentimes, the parents have to advocate. So the issue with gifted education is, on a national level, all we're really doing is saying these students exist. We're not really necessitating any type of services. So as it trickles down, things can get really lost. And that means that gifted education in South Carolina looks really different than gifted education in Nevada or in Colorado. And as you've seen, unfortunately, some states don't even require gifted education. So it's hard. I want to talk about South Carolina because the majority of us are from South Carolina, even though I'm living in Charlotte. So I'll just give you an overview of how identification works in South Carolina. You should have read this within that practice manual. But just to recap, if you find, I can't remember what page it's on, but there is a really good table that has the 3 dimensions dimension A, B, and C for identification, and does a good job kind of summarizing this. So I would recommend that as an educator and advocate for gifted children, that you maybe print that table out and keep it with you. But to talk through those three different dimensions, the first dimension A is aptitude. So aptitude at a 96th percentile if you're in grades 3 through 12, at a 98th percentile if you are in grades 1 through 2. That really high aptitude, if you have that 96th or 98th percentile, can automatically bring the student into gifted and talented services. So if it's a very high aptitude, which is not measuring achievement of a specific subject, but more measuring what someone calls general intelligence, reasoning ability, problem-solving ability. Usually we use the COGAT for that. A very high aptitude score will automatically have you identified for gifted and talented services. That's dimension A. So dimension A is aptitude. Dimension B is achievement. So achievement is tied to reading or mathematics scores. In South Carolina, they use PACT. So a certain percentile, I believe it's 94th percentile, will qualify you in the terms of achievement in reading or math. So the difference between achievement and aptitude, achievement is measuring something that you've been taught. So like your reading has been taught, your math skills have been taught, versus aptitude is seen as this general intelligence. You could take a whole other class on achievement versus aptitude. So that is dimension B. And dimension C is your intellectual and academic performance. So that's where your GPA comes in. If you're a younger student, that's where what's called Project STAR comes in. And that is where we have the most impact as the teacher, because we see these students every day and we see how they're performing in the classroom, and they are demonstrating this above average academic or intellectual performance. So we have three different dimensions. Dimension A is aptitude, and if you're really high in aptitude, you're automatically into the gifted and talented program. Dimension B is achievement, and dimension C is that intellectual academic performance. It takes 2 out of 3 of these dimensions to be identified for gifted and talented services. So you have to have B and C, or A and B, or A and C, unless you have that super high aptitude, that 96th or 98th percentile, in which you're automatically identified for gifted services. What's great about South Carolina is all students are required to be screened. So everyone should be taking these tests and considered for gifted education services, which is a great thing. That is what we call universal screening, and theoretically should reduce bias because everyone has the opportunity to be screened. So the reason I wanted to talk through that is we have these 3 dimensions. Where does a checklist come in? Why would we spend all of this time looking at characteristics and checklists if they don't actually come into the identification procedures themselves? So a couple things on that. Number 1, certain states do use checklists like this as part of their identification procedures. South Carolina does not. However, these tools are so important because they have such an impact on teacher perceptions on what giftedness is and what creativity is. And guys, teachers have such an impact on how their students perform. If the teacher expects the student to thrive, that student will rise to the occasion. If a teacher is constantly expecting the student not to do well, that student will respond to that expectation. So it's really in gifted education about providing the opportunity for students to demonstrate their knowledge, for students to demonstrate their gifts and talents. And as educators, if we don't believe our students have that ability, then we're not going to provide the appropriate context for them to demonstrate their knowledge. So I think that characteristic checklists always have a place, even if they're not used in these formal identification procedures, because they're very important for teacher perception. And teacher perception and expectation has a direct impact on the student's performance. So I really wanted to emphasize that and make sure that you know that maybe just because this actual checklist wouldn't be used in identification procedures, it's still going to have an impact. And depending upon which state you work in, some of these checklists would be used for actual identification processes. Again, I would really encourage you, look into the South Carolina manual if that is where you are teaching, which the majority of you are, so you're very familiar with how these 3 dimensions work. And as advocates for gifted education, if you have these students in your classroom who you know this characteristic checklist now, not just this checklist, but you know the characteristics of gifted children, just keep this in mind and start to see your students from a different perspective. And that change in perspective can really trickle down and impact the student themselves about how they perform and how they respond in the classroom. So I wanted to talk about identification, which is a good lead-in to this right versus privilege. So I will be honest, this is the hardest case study for me. I struggle with it. I really couldn't put words to how I felt about it until I read Cynthia's post, and she did a really interesting thing, and she talked about the importance of the difference between a legislative right and a moral right. And I had never thought to do that, but she makes the argument that all gifted children have a moral and ethical right to the types of services that the students in this case study had. However, when we look at the legislation and everything that dictates gifted education, that moral right isn't necessarily supported by the law. And I thought that was a really interesting and really thoughtful way to approach this case study and think about, well, they have a moral right to this. Yes, I want all gifted students to be challenged and receive these services, but maybe at this moment, there's not the laws that necessitate these moral rights. So I thought that was really interesting. I appreciated Cynthia's post and how she really did a good job parceling through all of the different legislations that relate to gifted education. Drew did a good job by saying, in a dream world, everyone should have this opportunity, but in the real world, that's not necessarily true. A lot of you all pointed to the lack of consistency from state to state. Since we all are defining giftedness at a state-to-state level, I've talked about this before, but what if you're gifted in one state but not the next, and you're receiving these very inconsistent services? Which is a big problem in gifted education. I like how Allison said that really gifted education is the responsibility of everyone. Several of you mentioned that everyone should really unite around these students, whether it's the regular education teacher, the gifted education teacher, even the parents. It's everyone's moral responsibility to be advocating for these children. So I wanted to be devil's advocate here. Do I agree personally that it's everyone's right and everyone's responsibility to serve the gifted? Clearly, this is what I have my doctoral degree in. Clearly, I am passionate about serving gifted and talented children. However, there's not a lot of accountability in gifted ed. So since there is not any federal law that's saying we have to serve all these gifted students, that responsibility falls to the states, and oftentimes that responsibility then falls to the districts. So there's not a lot of accountability of, are these students getting the differentiated services that they deserve? So from a passionate standpoint, absolutely, everyone is responsible. From a real-world standpoint, it's hard to hold individuals accountable and say, well, you're the teacher or you're the parent, you have to advocate for your gifted child. I wish it was like that, but it's really important that you know the law so that you know the challenge that we face as advocates for gifted children, and know that we have to really stand up for this right, because you will have so many even fellow educators just say it's not that important. These students can get there on their own. We don't need to focus on them. That's just the sad truth, and it's something that I come up against quite often in my role as a consultant or even teaching these courses. But I do appreciate you guys really thinking through this process and thinking through the importance of accountability and looking at these laws with a critical eye. It's important that you know this. It's important that you know the lack of consistency from one state to the next, even from one school to the next, because that should at least increase the responsibility that you feel to be a really important advocate for these students. One thing I did want to point out, this is getting a little ahead into what we call the invisible gifted, but several of you pointed to the importance of parents advocating for their children. And that is so important. And it's so important not to assume that only certain parents will do that. So there are some parents who come from just more well-off backgrounds that we may think are more likely to advocate for their students and knock on the teacher's door and say, my student deserves gifted services. But it's also important to realize that parents from less affluent backgrounds oftentimes have a similar desire to advocate for their students, but they don't have the similar opportunity. So what if you are a single mom and you're working so many jobs to keep food on the table and to keep a house for your children? You may not be able to go to that PTA meeting. That doesn't mean you don't care and you don't want to advocate. It means it's harder to advocate. So it's really important when we start thinking about underrepresentation in gifted education that we don't assume, and I'm not saying any of us are, I'm just saying in my work with this, I've had experience outside of this class. People say, well, only certain parents want to advocate. Well, that's not true. It's just we all have different opportunities to advocate. So it's important that we're not putting all of the responsibility on the parent without also giving them the appropriate tools and access to advocate for their children. So again, from a personal standpoint, yes, it is totally everyone's responsibility to advocate for these students. That's one of the reasons why it's important that we understand what giftedness is in the first place. However, when we look at the laws and everything that is behind gifted education, we'll see that accountability really falls in the states and more the districts, and that's where we run into some problems because it's kind of all over the place. So please do keep your eye on that discussion board, even though we're finished with it for the week. This is one of those discussions that I want you to keep digging into, so I will continue to look at them. I try not to respond too much because I want this to be between you guys, so every once in a while I can't resist and I come into the discussion posts. But I would just encourage you to keep posting even though you've already done your required posts for the week. So all of that to be said, this week I actually changed the assignment. So on your syllabus you were required to complete what's called a gifted education philosophy statement. In reading through your case studies and your discussion posts, I can already tell that you really care about this. So I changed the assignment to something that I think will hopefully be more applicable. So as we are shifting between understanding what giftedness is and more to a sense of, okay, we need to do something about it, I want to equip you all to start to have these conversations about why gifted education is important. So what I've changed the assignment to, I'm calling it a gifted education flyer. Really what I'm looking for is like a one-pager about the necessity of gifted education. Think about being trapped in an elevator for 3 minutes with a colleague who just thinks we don't need gifted ed, or you're an administrator who thinks that gifted ed isn't important, how are you going to respond? So the challenge is to create this one-page flyer, which I know is hard because there is a lot of information about gifted education, but to synthesize what we have done this entire class so far onto one page, and advertise the importance of gifted education. So this is on Blackboard, but the components you need to include here are: who are the gifted? What are some common myths regarding gifted students? Do gifted students really require differentiated services? And how can various individuals support gifted students? So within this flyer, you're approaching all 4 of those questions. To do this with any type of evidence, any type of support, you can't just say gifted students are important. There are going to be people who disagree with you. So I need to see on this flyer some type of evidence, some type of convincing evidence, whether it is from research, which it should be, and also from anecdotal support, which it should be. On this one-page flyer, you need to be able to grab someone's attention and say, whoa, I didn't realize gifted students have unique needs and aren't actually supported within the regular education classroom. You need to synthesize all of the information so that you have this one page that you can hand to your principal, you can hand to your colleague and say, we need to serve these students. So this is hopefully a tool that you could use as an advocate for gifted education. Please make sure you look at the rubric that is associated with the assignment. Please make sure you are addressing all 4 of those components of gifted education and that you're supporting your claims with appropriate research and appropriate evidence. Again, this is not a paper, so I'm not looking for like a one-page paper. I'm looking for bullets and information and further resources, anything you think would be helpful in advocating for the gifted child. My hope is that you would keep this paper, this flyer printed out, and that you could refer to it when you have these conversations. It's kind of like your go-to information. So if people don't care about gifted ed, they're not going to want to hear you ramble. They're not going to want to hear you answer some specific questions really quickly. And it's my hope that with this assignment, I'm equipping you to do that. So just to be clear, this is replacing what was on your syllabus as the Gifted Education Philosophy Statement, and it's now called the Gifted Education Flyer, and it's really meant to be a tool for you to synthesize all of the information we have gone through and prepare you to advocate for gifted children. So, as always, I'll be looking for that assignment by Sunday evening. And again, please be sure to keep an eye out on the discussion posts as we continue this right versus privilege conversation. I've said it several times, but I'm really encouraged by this class. Please do not hesitate to email me or call the office with any questions or any suggestions. This is a class that is built to prepare you for a very real world experience with gifted education. So if there's specific topics you want me to discuss, I would love to hear that. I hope that you have a wonderful week. I hope that this assignment will just prepare you to have those somewhat difficult conversations. And if you have any questions, you know how to reach me. But otherwise, I hope that you're all doing really well. And I'm sorry for rambling. You can tell that this is a topic that I get really into. All right, thank you.